My boyfriend confessed that he might not actually love me anymore. Before my boyfriend Steven and I dated, he had someone else who was special to him. Jackie, my best friend. They were that couple who made people roll their eyes from how cute they were together. When they got engaged, I was genuinely happy for them. But on the day they were supposed to get married, Jackie disappeared. There was no call, no text, no explanation, just gone. And Steven was completely destroyed. I stayed with him that entire month just making sure he didn't do anything stupid. And soon, something between us shifted. 8 months later, we started dating and we've been going steady ever since. Until 2 nights ago when Jackie came back abruptly. I didn't even know she was in town until I saw how Steven was acting like a complete mess all day. Distracted, forgetful, just absolutely out of it. He'd forget we had plans. He'd stare at his phone during dinner. He'd zone out mid-conversation like his mind was somewhere else entirely. And it worried me. So that evening, I finally asked him, "Is everything okay?" He stared at me with wide eyes, suddenly out of the weird trance, and flashed a smile. "I'm fine," he said, clearly a lie. "Is it because Jackie's back in town?" "I mean, I heard from my mom, but..." "I don't want to talk about her," he snapped. My heart jumped at the sharpness of his words. It was the first time he'd ever spoken to me like that. I bit my lip trying to fight back tears and asked quietly, "Steven, do you still love me?" His face softened immediately. He pulled me into a hug and said yes. He held me tight and told me he loved me, but I felt it in my gut that he was only trying to convince himself that he loved me. I quickly found out just how true his words were the night after. It was supposed to be our anniversary celebration, 3 years together. I got to the restaurant early after work and sat at our usual table. I ordered his favorite wine, laid out the gift I got for him on the table, and waited. An hour passed and I was still there waiting, checking my phone every 2 minutes, worried that something bad happened to him. After 3 hours of sitting there, I finally got a text. "Sorry, can't make it. Something came up." That was it. No phone call. Just those 7 words. But I knew exactly where he was. I drove to the park where the 3 of us used to hang out in college. The spot by the lake where we'd stay up talking until sunrise. And I saw them sitting there together on the bench. Steven looked at her with the softest, patient expression. Something he never once showed me in the 3 years we dated. I walked closer but stayed hidden behind the trees, close enough to hear everything. "I can't believe you're really here," Steven said, his voice breaking. "Where were you all this time? Why'd you leave?" "I'm so sorry for everything," Jackie said, placing her hand over his gently. It was all moving so fast between us back then. I kept telling myself I was ready for marriage when I wasn't. So I ran. But all these years, Steven, there was no one else on my mind but you." She lifted his hand to her lips and pressed it gently. "But I heard you're with someone else now." Steven lowered his eyes and nodded. "It just kind of happened." My chest tightened at his words. Just happened? Everything between us summarized like it was an accident? "Do you love her?" Jackie asked bluntly, her eyes meeting his. The silence between them stretched on. "Honestly, I don't know. I thought I did, but seeing you again, I'm not sure anymore." Jackie leaned closer. "Is there still a chance for us? If I wanted to try again?" I knew he'd been waiting 3 years to say yes. So before he could answer, I stepped out from behind the trees, walked up to them, and pulled off the promise ring he'd given me last Christmas when he had told me he was ready for a happy ending. I dropped it in his hand. "Wait," he called out, but I kept walking, still stupidly holding on to the hope that he'd follow me and stop me. He didn't. And that told me everything I needed to know. He didn't come home that night, or the next night, or the night after that. So I packed his things into boxes and left them by the door, changed the locks, deleted his number. Did all the things he never had the guts to do when Jackie felt him years ago. And 5 days later, he knocked on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there looking exhausted. He held the ring up and knocked again. "Can we talk?" His voice was muffled through the door. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please. Can I come in? Just to talk. That's all I'm asking." I stood there with my hand on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to open it. Part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. Part of me still loved him despite everything. But just when I made my decision, my phone buzzed with a new text from Jackie that read, "Please hear him out. There's something you have to know. Something we never told you." I unlock the door and pull it open just wide enough to see him standing there in the hallway light. Steven looks awful. His hair is messy like he's been running his hands through it for days. His eyes are red and puffy. The shirt he's wearing is wrinkled and has a stain on the collar. He's holding that promise ring between his thumb and finger like it's burning his skin, but he can't let go of it. I glance down at my phone again and read Jackie's text one more time. The words don't make any more sense than they did 5 seconds ago. Steven opens his mouth to say something, but I cut him off before he can start whatever speech he's prepared. I tell him Jackie just texted me saying there's something I need to know, something they never told me. His face goes completely white, not pale, not tired looking, but actually white like all the blood just drained out of his head. He takes a step backward and his shoulder hits the hallway wall. He leans against it like his legs might give out. I watch him try to form words, but nothing comes out at first. Then he closes his eyes and takes a deep breath. When he opens them again, he looks directly at me and says, "We need to sit down because it's complicated and he should have told me years ago." I step back from the doorway without saying anything. He walks in slowly like he's not sure I'll actually let him stay. I close the door behind him and lock it out of habit. We move toward the living room and I sit on the chair by the window. Not the couch where we usually sit together. Not anywhere near him. Steven sits on the far end of the couch and the space between us feels huge. He's still holding that ring. His hands are shaking. I wait for him to start talking. The silence stretches out so long I can hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Finally, Steven begins speaking and his voice sounds rough like he's been crying. He tells me the reason Jackie left on their wedding day wasn't because of cold feet or fear of commitment. 2 weeks before the wedding, she found out her mother had early onset Alzheimer's. Her father had been hiding how bad it was for months. Steven says Jackie's mom didn't even recognize her at the final dress fitting. Jackie had gone to her parents' house to show her mom the finished dress, and her mother looked at her like she was a stranger. Asked who she was, asked why she was in her house. Jackie's father pulled her aside and finally admitted that her mother had been getting worse for over a year. He'd been covering for her, making excuses, telling people she was tired or stressed. He was ashamed and thought he could handle it alone. Steven keeps talking, and I just sit there trying to process what he's saying. He explains that Jackie's father begged her not to tell anyone about the diagnosis. He didn't want people knowing, didn't want them treating his wife differently. Jackie was supposed to get married and move 3 states away with Steven for his new job, the job he'd already accepted, the apartment they'd already put a deposit on. But her mother was dying, losing herself piece by piece. And Jackie couldn't just leave. She couldn't abandon her mother when she needed her most. But she also couldn't figure out how to choose between the man she loved and her dying mother. So instead of explaining any of it, she just ran. She disappeared on the wedding day because she didn't know how to say the words out loud, didn't know how to break Steven's heart while her own heart was breaking. I feel something shifting inside me as he talks. The anger I've been carrying starts mixing with confusion. This completely changes the story I thought I knew for 3 years. I thought Jackie was selfish. I thought she just got scared and bailed on Steven without caring about the damage she caused. But this is different. This is impossible and terrible, and I don't know what to do with it. I ask Steven why he never told me this. Why he let me think Jackie was just some person who broke his heart for no good reason. My voice comes out sharper than I mean it to. He looks down at his hands and the ring catches the light. He admits he only found out the truth himself 6 months ago. 6 months. Half of our relationship. Jackie's father had a stroke and she finally reached out to Steven to explain everything. To apologize. To tell him why she left. Steven has been carrying this knowledge since then. Knowing that Jackie didn't leave because she stopped loving him. Knowing she left because she was drowning in an impossible situation and didn't know how to ask for help. I watch his face as he talks, and I can see it in his eyes. This has mattered every single day since he found out. Every single day he's been with me while knowing the truth about her. He says he didn't tell me because he'd convinced himself it didn't matter. Jackie was gone and they were building something real together. He thought he could just keep the information locked away and it wouldn't affect anything. But I can see now that it affected everything. The way he'd zone out sometimes. The way he'd get quiet when anyone mentioned weddings or sick parents. The way he never fully seemed present even in our happiest moments. I ask him directly if he's been in contact with Jackie during these past 6 months. The question hangs in the air between us. Steven hesitates. It's only a few seconds, but it feels like forever. Then he admits they've exchanged a few emails. Just updates about her mom's condition and her dad's recovery. Just checking in. Nothing romantic, nothing inappropriate. But my stomach drops anyway because those emails mean he's been emotionally involved with her this whole time. He's been thinking about her and caring about her situation while promising me a future. While giving me that promise ring and talking about being ready for our happy ending. Steven must see something in my face because he starts talking faster. He swears the emails were innocent. He never planned to act on any feelings. He thought he had everything under control. But then Jackie came back to town because her father needs help selling the family house. He can't manage it alone after the stroke. She came back to handle the estate, and suddenly she was here in person. Not just words on a screen. Actually here. And seeing her destroyed all the walls Stephen had built up. All the ways he'd convinced himself he was over her. He's been a complete mess trying to figure out what he actually feels versus what he thinks he should feel. Trying to figure out if what we have is real, or if he's just been using me as a safe, comfortable place to hide from his unresolved feelings. I realize as he talks that he's been lying to both of us. Maybe even to himself. I stand up from the chair because I can't sit still anymore. I tell him I need him to leave. I need space to process this because I can't think clearly with him sitting here looking desperate and guilty. Stephen starts to argue. He says we should talk more, work through this together, but I'm firm. I point to the boxes I packed by the door. I tell him to take what he needs and go. He sits there for another minute like he's trying to decide if he should push back. Then finally he stands up and walks to the door. He grabs his keys from the hook and opens one of the boxes to pull out some clothes. He says he'll stay with Ryder for a few days. Give me the space I need. Then we can talk again. I don't respond. I just watch him gather his things and walk out the door. When it closes behind him, I turn the lock and stand there in the silent apartment. The clock is still ticking in the kitchen. The refrigerator hums. Outside, I can hear cars passing on the street. I walk back to the living room and sit on the couch where Stephen was sitting. The cushion is still warm from his body. I look around at the apartment we shared and realize I don't even know who I'm angry at anymore. Jackie for leaving, Stephen for lying, myself for not seeing it sooner. All of us for this mess we've created. I sit there on that couch for maybe an hour just staring at nothing. The apartment feels too quiet without him here. I pick up my phone and scroll through old photos of us, and it makes my chest hurt worse. Around 11:30, I realize I'm not going to sleep tonight, so I call Zoe. She answers on the second ring, sounding half asleep, but she wakes up fast when she hears my voice. I tell her everything that happened with Stephen tonight, about the emails with Jackie and the lies, and how he admitted he doesn't know what he feels anymore. Zoe listens without interrupting, and when I finish, she's quiet for a minute. Then she says something that makes my stomach drop. She tells me maybe I fell in love with the idea of saving Stephen instead of actually loving him as a whole person. I want to argue with her and defend myself, but the words stick in my throat because part of me knows she's right. I spent 3 years trying to be enough for someone who was never fully present with me. Zoe stays on the phone with me until almost 2 a.m, and by the time we hang up, I feel wrung out but a little clearer. The next morning, I wake up exhausted and my eyes are puffy from crying. I make coffee and sit at the kitchen table staring at my phone. I know what I need to do. I open my messages and text Jackie directly. I tell her we need to talk face to face, just the two of us without Stephen involved. She responds within 5 minutes, agreeing to meet me at a coffee shop downtown that afternoon. I spend the whole morning pacing around the apartment, rehearsing what I want to say to her. I practice in front of the bathroom mirror like I'm preparing for a presentation. But I know when I actually see her, I'll probably forget everything I planned. At 1:30, I drive to the coffee shop and get there 15 minutes early. I order a tea I don't really want, and sit at a table by the window watching people walk past outside. When Jackie arrives at 2, she looks different from I expected. She looks older and tired, not like the carefree college girl I remember from photos on Stephen's old social media. There are dark circles under her eyes and her hair is pulled back in a messy bun. She spots me and walks over, and I stand up awkwardly, not sure if we should hug or shake hands or what. She thanks me for meeting her and sits down across from me. Before I can say anything, she immediately apologizes for the text last night. She says she realized after sending it that it was cruel to drop that bomb without explanation. I nod and tell her that's why I wanted to talk. We both order coffee, and then she starts telling me about the last 3 years. She talks about her mother who had early onset Alzheimer's and how she slowly forgot everyone she loved. Jackie's voice cracks when she describes watching her mom not recognize her own daughter. She tells me about moving back home to care for her full-time, about giving up her job and her apartment and her whole life. She explains that her mom died 4 months ago and it destroyed her because she'd given up everything to care for her, including Stephen and the life they'd planned together. Jackie says she came back to town not to steal Stephen back, but to finally give him the closure and apology he deserved after disappearing on their wedding day. But when she saw him at the park the other night, all the old feelings came rushing back and she panicked. She admits she told him she wanted to try again because in that moment it felt true. I sit there listening and processing and trying to figure out how I feel about all this. Finally, I ask her directly what she wants from Stephen now. Jackie is quiet for a long moment and stares down at her coffee cup. Then she admits she doesn't know. She says part of her will always love him, but she's also aware she destroyed his trust and hurt him terribly. She tells me she's not sure if she actually wants to try again, or if she's just lonely and grieving and grasping for something familiar. Then Jackie tells me something that shifts my perspective completely. She says Steven talked about me during their conversation at the park. He told her I was kind and patient, and that I'd helped him heal when he was broken. Jackie looks right at me and says she could see he cared about me, but she could also see he'd never fully let go of her, and that's not fair to anyone involved. We end up talking for almost 2 hours, and somewhere in that conversation, I realize Jackie isn't the villain I wanted her to be. She's just a person who made an impossible choice and handled it badly, and now everyone is paying for it. Near the end, she tells me she's planning to move back to her mom's hometown to settle the estate and start over somewhere without all these memories. She says she needs a fresh start away from here. When we leave the coffee shop and say goodbye, I feel emotionally exhausted but also lighter somehow. I drive home and walk into my apartment and immediately see Steven has texted me asking if we can talk again. I stare at the message for a minute, then put my phone face down on the counter. I ignore it because I need time to figure out what I actually want instead of just reacting to what everyone else needs. Around 6 that evening, Zoe shows up at my door with takeout from my favorite Thai place. She doesn't ask questions, just comes in and sets up the food and puts on a bad action movie. We eat pad thai and watch explosions, and I try not to think about the mess my life has become. 3 days pass, and I spend them going to work and coming home and avoiding Steven's texts. Finally, on the 4th day, I agree to meet him. I tell him to meet me at the park, the same spot where everything fell apart. When I get there, he's already sitting on the bench looking nervous. He stands up when he sees me and starts apologizing, but I stop him. I tell him I talked to Jackie and know the whole story now about her mom and why she left. Then I ask him point blank if he's in love with her still. Steven struggles to answer, and his face does this complicated thing where I can see him trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he admits he doesn't know what he feels anymore. He says seeing Jackie brought back all the pain and love from before, but being with me has been comfortable and safe. The word comfortable hits me like a punch. I tell him that comfortable and safe isn't enough for me, that I deserve someone who knows without hesitation that they want to be with me. Steven looks devastated, but he doesn't argue because he knows I'm right. I stand up from the bench and Steven stands too, looking uncertain about what comes next. I tell him I think we need to take a real break, not just a few days of him staying at someone else's place, but actual separation to figure out what we want individually. He stares at me and asks if that means we're breaking up. I say honestly I don't know yet, but I know I can't keep waiting around while he decides if I'm enough for him. The words come out steady and clear even though my chest feels tight. Steven runs his hand through his hair and nods slowly. We agree he'll stay with Ryder for at least 2 weeks with no contact between us, no texts or calls or running into each other on purpose. He asks if he can hug me goodbye, and I shake my head because I know if he touches me right now, I might change my mind about all of this. I walk back to my car alone and drive home with the radio off, just sitting in silence trying to process what just happened. The apartment feels too quiet when I get there, so I text Zoe and tell her I need her to come over. She shows up an hour later with wine and ice cream and doesn't ask questions, just sits with me on the couch while I cry. The next week at work is brutal because I'm distracted and sad and can't focus on anything for more than 5 minutes. I mess up a client presentation because I forget half the slides I was supposed to prepare. My coworker Margot notices during a team meeting when I zone out completely while someone is talking directly to me. She's a blunt older woman in her 50s who's been divorced twice and doesn't take nonsense from anyone. After the meeting, she corners me in the break room while I'm trying to make coffee. She plants herself between me and the door and demands to know what's wrong because I've been acting like a zombie for days. I try to brush it off and say I'm just tired, but Margot crosses her arms and tells me she's not buying it. Something about her direct approach makes me crumble, and I end up telling her everything about Steven and Jackie and the park and the separation. She listens without interrupting or judging, just nodding occasionally while I pour out the whole messy story. When I finish, she's quiet for a moment. Then she tells me about her first marriage to a man who was still hung up on his ex-wife. Margot says she spent 5 years trying to be enough for him, cooking his favorite meals and supporting his career and being patient while he worked through his feelings. But she was competing with a ghost, with a perfect memory of someone who wasn't even there anymore. She finally realized she could never win that competition because she was fighting against an idea, not a real person. Margot looks me right in the eye and says the kindest thing I can do for myself is walk away and let Steven figure out his mess without me waiting in the wings like some backup option. Her words hurt because they're true, and I know it deep in my bones. She squeezes my shoulder and tells me I deserve someone who chooses me first, not someone who has to lose everyone else before he appreciates what he has. I go back to my desk feeling raw, but also strangely lighter, like someone finally gave me permission to put myself first. The days drag by slowly, and I throw myself into work projects to avoid thinking about Steven. I wonder if he's thinking about me, or if he's thinking about Jackie, or if he's just confused about everything. 2 weeks into our separation, my phone buzzes with a text from Ryder asking if we can grab coffee. I stare at the message for a long time because I'm surprised he's reaching out since Ryder was Steven's friend first, from college before I even came into the picture. But I agree to meet him the next day at a cafe near my office. When I get there, Ryder is already sitting at a corner table looking uncomfortable. He stands up when he sees me, and we do that awkward thing where we're not sure if we should hug or not. We sit down and order coffee, and then Ryder just comes out with it. He tells me Steven has been a complete disaster, barely eating or sleeping and spending hours just staring at his phone like he wants to call someone but can't decide who. Ryder says Steven's been staying on his couch for 2 weeks, and it's been hard to watch him fall apart like this. I don't know what to say to that, so I just nod and wait for him to continue. Ryder admits he's frustrated with Steven because he's watched him waste years being stuck between the past and the present, never fully committing to anything or anyone. He tells me that Steven is terrified of making the wrong choice and ending up alone, which is why he's been paralyzed instead of being honest with anyone, including himself. Ryder says I deserve better than being someone's backup plan, even if Steven doesn't consciously see it that way. The words echo what Margot told me, and I feel that same truth settling in my chest. I ask Ryder if he thinks Steven is still in love with Jackie. He sighs and runs his hand over his face before answering. He says yes, he does think Steven still loves Jackie, but he also thinks Steven has real feelings for me that got all tangled up with gratitude and fear of being alone again after she left. Ryder tells me Steven needs to choose based on what he actually wants, not what feels safe or what he thinks he should want. He apologizes for being so blunt but says someone needs to be honest about this situation. We finish our coffee and Ryder hugs me before we leave, telling me to take care of myself no matter what Steven decides. I drive home feeling oddly calm, like pieces are finally falling into place even though nothing is resolved. That night my phone rings and I see Jackie's name on the screen. My heart jumps because we haven't talked since that conversation at the coffee shop weeks ago. I answer and she sounds nervous, speaking quickly like she's afraid I'll hang up. She tells me she's leaving town in 3 days. She's decided to take a job in her mom's hometown and make a clean break from everything here, from all the memories and the pain and the complicated history. Jackie says she wants to meet one more time before she goes, because she needs to tell me something important about her last conversation with Steven. I agree to meet her the next morning, even though I'm not sure I want to hear whatever she has to say. We meet at a different coffee shop across town, one where none of us have any history. Jackie looks tired but determined when she walks in and sits across from me. She orders tea and then takes a deep breath before starting. She tells me that Steven came to see her 2 days ago, that he showed up at her dad's house unannounced. He told her he's been thinking about everything, and he realizes he's been unfair to both of us by not being honest about his feelings. Steven admitted to Jackie that he never stopped loving her, but he's also built a real relationship with me that matters to him, and he's terrified of choosing wrong and destroying someone in the process. Jackie's eyes get watery as she talks, and I can see this is hard for her too. She says she told Steven that she's leaving and taking herself out of the equation because she can't be the reason he hurts someone else the way she hurt him 3 years ago. Jackie made it clear she's not coming back to this city, and that he needs to decide what he wants with me based on our relationship alone, not in comparison to what they had or what might have been. I feel a strange mix of relief and sadness hearing this. Relief that she's removing herself from the situation, but sadness that it took all this pain to get here. Jackie reaches across the table and touches my hand gently. She apologizes directly for causing this mess, and for the text that started everything spiraling. She says she sees now that I genuinely care about Steven, and that I was there for him when he needed someone most, that I helped him survive the worst period of his life. Jackie tells me she hopes that whatever happens between Steven and me, I don't let this experience make me doubt my own worth or my capacity to love someone fully. Her voice cracks a little and I realize she means every word. We finish our drinks and stand up to leave. Jackie hugs me tight and I hug her back, both of us holding on for a moment longer than necessary. As we pull apart, I realize I'm going to miss the friendship we might have had in another life, in a world where things were less complicated and painful. I watch her walk to her car and drive away, knowing this is probably the last time I'll see her. The next few days, I stayed home from work claiming I was sick, which wasn't entirely a lie since I felt physically exhausted from everything. I spent most of my time on the couch staring at the walls and thinking about my relationship with Steven in a way I'd never let myself before. I kept replaying moments from the past 3 years and noticing patterns I'd ignored. How he'd zone out sometimes when we were together, like part of his mind was somewhere else. How he never really shared his deeper feelings about anything, just surface level stuff about work or what movie we should watch. How I was always the one planning our future, talking about what we wanted, while he just nodded along without adding his own ideas. I told myself it was because of what Jackie did to him, that he needed time to fully trust again. But sitting there alone in the apartment, I realized maybe it was simpler than trauma. Maybe he just wasn't fully there with me because he didn't want to be, not in the way I needed him to be. I grabbed my phone and opened a new text to Steven. I typed out that Jackie was leaving town for good and we needed to have one final conversation about us, about what we actually were and what we wanted. I hit send before I could overthink it. His response came back in less than a minute saying yes, asking when and where. I told him to come to the apartment tomorrow afternoon. He replied with just okay, and I put my phone down, feeling weirdly calm about the whole thing. The next day, I cleaned the apartment even though it didn't need it, just to have something to do with my hands. When Steven knocked, I opened the door and saw him standing there looking nervous and tired. He stepped inside and glanced around like he was seeing the place for the first time. The apartment felt different now with both of us in it, less like the home we'd shared and more like a location where something used to happen. We sat on opposite ends of the couch with this huge space between us that felt bigger than just physical distance. Steven started talking first, saying he'd been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks. He admitted he'd been unfair to me from the very beginning of our relationship. He said he jumped into dating me before he was actually healed from what happened with Jackie, and while his feelings for me were real, he wasn't sure they were the kind of love I deserved. His voice cracked a little when he said that last part, and I could tell it was hard for him to admit. I appreciated his honesty even though hearing it out loud made my chest feel tight. I told him I'd been doing my own thinking too, and I realized something important. I said I needed to choose myself for once instead of waiting around for him to choose me. I explained that I deserved someone who was certain about me from the start, who didn't need to lose someone else first to appreciate what we had together. I watched Steven's eyes fill up with tears, but he nodded slowly because somewhere deep down he knew I was right. We sat there quietly for a minute and then shifted to talking about the practical stuff we'd been avoiding. The apartment lease, our shared furniture, all the little things we'd tangled together over 3 years. Steven said he'd move out completely and find his own place, so I could stay here if I wanted. I was surprised he was being so generous about it, but also sad that we'd reached this point where we needed to divide up our lives. We agreed to take a few days to figure out all the details before making anything official with the landlord. That weekend, Zoe drove up to help me start packing Steven's remaining things into boxes. She brought trash bags and packing tape and her no-nonsense attitude that I really needed. We worked through his closet, pulling out clothes and shoes, then moved to the bathroom, gathering his toiletries and the electric razor he always left on the counter. Zoe kept telling me she was proud of me for choosing to walk away, instead of settling for someone who only half wanted me. While we were sorting through a drawer in the bedroom, I found the promise ring Steven had tried to give back to me that night at the door. I held it up to the light and looked at it for a long moment. Zoe asked if I wanted to keep it, but I shook my head and dropped it in the box with his other stuff. That ring represented a future that was never really solid, just something I'd convinced myself was real because I wanted it so badly. The following Monday, I called the therapist number my insurance company gave me and made an appointment for that same week. I went to a small office in a building downtown and sat in the waiting room filling out paperwork about my mental health history. When the therapist called me back, I sat on her couch and started explaining everything about Steven and Jackie, and how I'd lost both a relationship and a friendship in one complicated mess. She listened without interrupting and then started asking questions that made me think about things differently. Over the next few sessions, she helped me understand that I'd been trying to earn Steven's complete love by being perfect and supportive, when real love shouldn't require constant proving. She said I'd turned myself into whatever I thought he needed instead of just being myself, and seeing if that was enough. The sessions were hard because they forced me to look at my own patterns, but they were also helpful in ways I didn't expect. 2 weeks later, Steven texted saying he'd found an apartment across town and was ready to move his stuff out. We met at my place to exchange keys and finish separating everything we'd mixed together. When I saw him, he looked different somehow. Lighter, maybe. Like he was finally facing reality instead of hiding from it. He told me he'd also started seeing a therapist to work through his abandonment issues and his pattern of not being fully present in relationships. We loaded his boxes into his car, making multiple trips up and down the stairs. I handed him his key to the apartment and he gave me back the spare I'd given him years ago. We stood there in the parking lot for a minute, not really knowing how to say goodbye. Finally, he just said thanks for everything and got in his car. I watched him drive away, and then went back upstairs to the apartment that was fully mine now. A month passed, and I was getting used to living alone, to having the whole bed to myself and not having to coordinate my schedule with anyone else. One afternoon, I was scrolling through social media when I got a message request from someone named Nicole Schaffer. I accepted it and saw it was Jackie's younger sister, who I'd only met a handful of times in college. Her message said she wanted to thank me for being kind to Jackie during their last conversation before she left town. Nicole wrote that Jackie was doing better in her new city, starting to build a life that was completely hers. She said Jackie talked about me sometimes, about how I'd handled everything with more grace than she deserved. I responded saying I was glad Jackie was doing okay, and Nicole wrote back immediately asking if I wanted to grab lunch sometime. I agreed, and we set a date for the following weekend. We met at a casual place near my apartment, and Nicole looked so much like Jackie, it caught me off guard for a second. We ordered food, and then she started telling me more details about what Jackie had gone through with their mom's illness. She explained how their whole family fell apart during that time, with their dad completely shutting down emotionally, and Jackie carrying everything by herself. Nicole said she was too young back then to help much, and she'd carried guilt about it ever since, watching her sister sacrifice her own life to take care of their mom alone. She talked about how their dad refused to accept help from anyone, how he kept insisting he could handle it when clearly he couldn't. Nicole's voice got quiet when she described visiting the house during that time and seeing how bad things had gotten, how their mom didn't recognize anyone anymore, and their dad was barely holding it together. Listening to her helped me understand Jackie's choices in a different way, not excusing the pain those choices caused, but at least seeing the impossible situation she'd been trapped in. Nicole said she'd always wondered if things could have been different if their family had been more honest about needing help, if their dad hadn't been so stubborn about keeping it all private. We finished lunch and Nicole hugged me before we left, thanking me again for meeting with her. I drove home thinking about how complicated people's lives are, how you never really know what someone else is carrying around with them. The next week at work, I buried myself in a big campaign pitch for a new client, staying late most nights to perfect the presentation deck. I was in the conference room reviewing slides when Margot walked by and stopped in the doorway. She studied me for a moment and then said I looked different somehow. Lighter, maybe. I asked her what she meant, and she came in and sat down across from me. She told me I'd been carrying myself differently lately, standing straighter, not hunching my shoulders like I was trying to take up less space. I hadn't noticed, but she was right. Something had shifted in me over the past few weeks. Margot said it seemed like I'd stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine to hold, and hearing her say it out loud made me realize that's exactly what had happened. I'd been carrying Steven's pain about being left, Jackie's guilt about leaving, and my own fear of not being enough, and somewhere along the way I'd finally put all of it down. The freedom of it hit me sitting there in that conference room, how much energy I'd been spending on things that were never my responsibility to fix. 2 months after Steven moved out, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I'd deleted but still recognized. He was asking if we could meet for coffee, not to get back together but just to talk as friends. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out if I was ready for that. Part of me wanted to ignore it and keep moving forward, but another part wanted closure, wanted to see if he'd actually changed, or if this was just another attempt to ease his guilt. I finally texted back saying yes, and we agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown on Saturday morning. When I got there, he was already sitting at a corner table, and he looked different from I remembered. Calmer somehow, more settled in himself, not fidgeting or checking his phone every few seconds like he used to. We ordered our drinks and sat down, and there was this awkward moment where neither of us knew how to start. Finally, he thanked me for meeting him and said he'd been wanting to reach out for weeks, but wasn't sure if I'd want to hear from him. Steven started telling me about the therapy he'd been doing, how his counselor had been pushing him to confront why he was always so afraid of being alone. He said he'd realized he jumped straight from his broken engagement into supporting me, and then from my support into dating me, without ever actually sitting with himself and dealing with his issues. He admitted he'd been using relationships as a way to avoid facing his fear of abandonment, letting other people's needs distract him from his own problems. He looked me in the eyes and thanked me for forcing him to finally face his patterns, instead of enabling them like everyone else in his life had done. Hearing him take responsibility like that surprised me, because the Steven I knew would have made excuses or blamed circumstances. I asked him if he'd been in contact with Jackie at all, and he shook his head no. He said he was respecting her decision to start fresh, and he was trying to do the same thing for himself. He told me he'd probably always have complicated feelings about her, that you don't just stop loving someone who meant that much to you, but he was learning that you can love someone and still recognize the relationship wasn't healthy. The maturity in his words caught me off guard because this was growth I hadn't expected to see. Steven shifted in his seat and said he wanted to apologize for not being the partner I deserved, for letting me be his emotional support person instead of his equal. He said he'd leaned on me when he was broken, and then just kept leaning even after he didn't need to anymore, and that wasn't fair to either of us. He told me he hoped someday I'd find someone who chooses me first without hesitation, because that's what I deserved all along. I felt my throat get tight hearing him say the things I'd needed to hear months ago. I thanked him for the apology and told him I hoped he'd find peace with himself before trying to be with anyone else, because the next person didn't deserve to be his crutch either. We sat there for a minute in silence, and then he asked if I remembered the weekend we drove to the coast and got caught in that storm. I smiled because I did remember how we'd ended up stuck in this tiny motel and played cards for hours while rain pounded the windows. We started talking about other good memories from our relationship, and I realized something sitting there, that I didn't regret our time together even though it ended badly. Steven had helped me learn what I didn't want in a partner, what it felt like to be someone's second choice, and that was valuable even if it hurt. And I'd helped him start facing his unresolved trauma instead of running from it. Sometimes relationships serve a purpose even when they're not meant to last forever, and that was okay. 3 months after everything fell apart, I went to a party that my coworker was throwing and ended up talking to this guy named Jonas, who worked with her husband. We stood in the kitchen for an hour just chatting about random stuff, and he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. I said yes, even though I wasn't sure I was ready, and we made plans for the following week. The date was casual and low pressure. Just dinner at this Italian place near my apartment and conversation that flowed easily. What struck me most was how different it felt to be with someone who asked questions about me and actually listened to my answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Jonas wanted to know about my job and my hobbies and my family, and he seemed genuinely interested when I told him about my sister and the painting I'd been getting back into. I wasn't ready for anything serious, but it felt good to remember I was allowed to be pursued, that not every guy would treat me like a consolation prize. Zoe came to visit the following weekend, and we spent Saturday morning rearranging furniture in my apartment and hanging up the paintings I'd been working on. She kept commenting on how much happier I seemed living alone, how I was more like the person she remembered from before I started dating Steven. I asked her what she meant, and she said I'd been doing all these things lately that I'd stopped doing while with him, like going to concerts on weeknights and staying up late reading and taking random art classes. She pointed out that I'd been molding myself to fit his needs without even realizing how much of myself I'd set aside. We ordered takeout and sat on my couch eating pad thai straight from the containers, and I felt this wave of gratitude for my sister who'd stuck by me through all of this mess. The next Tuesday, I was at the grocery store picking up stuff for dinner when I literally almost crashed my cart into Ryder in the produce section. We both laughed, and he asked how I'd been doing, and we ended up chatting for a few minutes by the apples. I asked how Steven was, and Ryder told me he'd been focusing hard on his design work and his therapy sessions, that he seemed healthier than he'd been in years. Ryder said something that stuck with me, that he was grateful I'd been strong enough to walk away when Steven couldn't make a clear choice, because it forced Steven to finally grow up and deal with his issues. He told me Steven had been coasting through life, avoiding anything hard, and losing me was the wake-up call he needed. We said goodbye, and I pushed my cart toward the checkout, thinking about how strange it was that my pain had become someone else's catalyst for change. At my therapy session that week, I talked about how I was learning to be okay with the messy reality that I could be hurt by how things ended while also recognizing it was the right choice. My therapist nodded and said that's emotional maturity, being able to hold both truths at once without trying to make it simpler than it is. She told me a lot of people struggle with that, wanting to make their ex either all good or all bad. But real life is more complicated. I could acknowledge that Steven hurt me deeply, while also seeing that he was dealing with his own trauma, and I could be sad about losing the relationship while knowing I deserved better. Sitting in that therapy office, I felt proud of how far I'd come in just a few months, from the person crying at her door to someone who could look at the situation with clear eyes and honest feelings. At work the following week, my boss called me into her office and told me they were promoting me to senior account manager with a big raise and more responsibility. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I could actually breathe properly for the first time in months. Margot found me at my desk later and insisted on taking me out to celebrate that evening. We went to this wine bar downtown, and she ordered us both glasses of the expensive stuff. She looked at me across the table and said she'd been watching me these past few months, and I'd changed completely. She told me when I first started dating Steven, I seemed like I was always making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding. But now I took up space without apologizing for it. I asked her what she meant, and she said I spoke up in meetings now. I set boundaries with difficult clients. I stopped saying sorry for things that weren't my fault. Margot raised her glass and said she was proud of me for choosing myself when it would have been easier to just stay and settle. I realized sitting there that she'd become more than just a coworker who gave blunt advice. She was a real friend and mentor who'd helped me see my worth when I couldn't see it myself. 4 months after everything fell apart, I signed the lease on a smaller apartment across town. The place was just mine with only my name on all the paperwork, and that felt important somehow. Zoe drove up that weekend to help me move in and decorate. We spent Saturday painting one wall this deep blue color I'd always wanted, but Steven said was too dark. Zoe helped me hang my paintings all over the living room, the ones I'd been working on during those late nights when I couldn't sleep. We went to furniture stores, and I picked out a couch I actually liked instead of compromising on something neutral and boring. Zoe kept commenting on how the apartment felt completely different from the place I'd shared with Steven, like it had my personality all over it instead of being some generic space. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor eating it straight from the box because my table hadn't been delivered yet. She told me I seemed lighter somehow, more like the person she remembered from before I started dating him. I looked around at my blue wall and my paintings and my furniture choices and realized this was the first place that felt completely mine in years. One evening while scrolling through my phone, I saw that Jackie had posted something on social media about starting a support group for people taking care of family members with Alzheimer's in her new city. The post had dozens of comments from people thanking her and asking for information. I stared at it for a while, feeling this weird mix of emotions. Part of me was still hurt by everything that happened, but another part was genuinely happy she was turning her painful experience into something that helped others. I typed out a brief message telling her I was glad she was doing well, and that her support group sounded like it would help a lot of families. She responded within an hour with a warm thank you and said she appreciated my kindness after everything. We didn't say anything else, but it felt like the right amount of closure for where we were. A few weeks later, I went to a mutual friend's birthday party and saw Steven across the room. My stomach jumped at first, but then I realized I wasn't scared or angry, just neutral. He walked over and we chatted for a few minutes about our lives. He told me about this new design project he was really excited about, some branding work for a startup. I told him about my promotion and my new apartment. He seemed genuinely happy for me, and I was surprised to find I felt the same about his project. We weren't close anymore, but we were friendly, and that felt right for where we both were now. The conversation only lasted maybe 5 minutes before we naturally drifted to different parts of the party, but it didn't feel awkward or forced. Just two people who used to be together and now weren't. The next weekend, Jonas and I went to this Italian restaurant for our second date. This time, the conversation went deeper than surface stuff about work and hobbies. He asked about my past relationships, and I told him the whole story about Steven and Jackie without making myself the victim or the hero. I just explained what happened and what I'd learned from it. Jonas shared his own messy relationship history, about an ex who cheated on him and how long it took him to trust anyone again. I liked that we could both be honest about our pasts without pretending we were perfect or completely over everything. He didn't try to fix my story or tell me what I should have done differently. He just listened and nodded and said he understood why I made the choices I made. 5 months in, I was on the phone with Zoe during one of our weekly calls, and she asked if I'd seen Steven's latest social media posts. I realized I hadn't looked at his profile in weeks, maybe even a month. I told her that, and she laughed and said that was huge progress from the person who used to check his accounts multiple times a day. She was right. I'd stopped wondering what he was doing or who he was with or if he was happy. I was focused on my own life and my own growth for the first time in years. We laughed about how far I'd come from that first night when I showed up at her apartment crying and couldn't stop checking my phone. Back at the office, Margot pulled me aside one afternoon and said she'd noticed something. I'd been spending my lunch breaks with this younger coworker named Faye who was going through a bad breakup. Margot told me she'd overheard me giving Faye the same blunt advice she'd given me months ago about not settling for crumbs and recognizing her worth. I hadn't really thought about it, but she was right. I was passing on the wisdom that had helped me see clearly when I was drowning in confusion. It felt good to turn my painful experience into something useful for someone else, to help her avoid making the same mistakes I'd made. On our third date, Jonas took me to this Mexican place with really good tacos, and afterward we walked around the neighborhood looking at the old houses. When he walked me back to my car, he kissed me goodnight, and I didn't compare it to kissing Steven, or wonder if I was ready, or question whether I was making the right choice. I was just there in that moment with someone who seemed genuinely interested in knowing me. We made plans to go hiking the following weekend, and I found myself actually excited about getting to know him better, instead of being scared or guarded. 6 months after standing at that door deciding whether to let Steven in, I was sitting in my apartment that was completely mine talking to Zoe on the phone about holiday plans. She asked me point blank if I was happy, and I stopped to really think about it. The answer was yes, but not in some perfect fairy tale way. It was a real grounded, peaceful kind of happy. I'd chosen myself when it would have been easier to choose him, and that decision had led me here to this life that was actually mine. The card arrived on a Tuesday in a light blue envelope with Nicole's handwriting on the front. Inside, she'd written that Jackie wanted me to know her support group had helped dozens of families dealing with Alzheimer's, and she'd found real purpose in her new life. Nicole added her own note at the bottom saying she was grateful I'd been kind to her sister when I had every reason not to be. I read it twice, then put it on my fridge with a magnet. It sat there as a reminder that people are complicated and messy, and sometimes they hurt you without meaning to, and grace is always worth extending even when it's hard. The holidays rolled around, and I was stringing lights in my apartment when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it until I saw the message. Steven saying he wanted to reach out. Let me know he was doing well. Been single for 6 months and focusing on himself. Grateful for the time we had together. I stared at it for a minute, then typed back that I was glad he was finding peace. We exchanged a few more messages, nothing deep, just polite updates about our lives. Then the conversation naturally faded and we drifted back to our separate worlds. I finished hanging the lights and realized I felt nothing but calm. No anger, no sadness, just acceptance that we were both moving forward in different directions. Jonas and I hit the 2-month mark, and I kept noticing how different everything felt. He texted me every morning. He made plans a week in advance instead of last minute. When he said he'd call, he actually called. During my therapy session, I mentioned how strange it was to be with someone so consistent, and my therapist smiled. She pointed out that I was finally experiencing what it felt like to be someone's clear choice, not their backup plan or their comfort zone. The words hit me hard because she was right. With Steven, I'd always felt like I was competing with a ghost, trying to prove I was worth choosing. With Jonas, I didn't have to prove anything. He just showed up for me without me having to ask or wonder or worry. We were having dinner at this Italian place when Jonas asked me what I was looking for in a relationship. The question caught me off guard because most guys don't ask that directly. I put down my fork and thought about it before answering honestly. I told him I wanted someone who chooses me without hesitation, who shows up consistently, who's done the work to be emotionally available. Someone who doesn't make me guess where I stand or wonder if I'm enough. Jonas smiled and said that's exactly what he wanted too, that he thought we might be building something really good together. I smiled back and felt this quiet certainty that maybe we were. 7 months after everything changed, I was sitting in my apartment on a Saturday morning drinking coffee and looking around at the space that was completely mine. I had my promotion at work that came with better pay and more responsibility. I had regular therapy sessions every other week that kept me grounded. I had this growing friendship with Margot, who'd become like a mentor, and Nicole, who I grabbed lunch with sometimes to talk about her sister and life in general. And I was dating Jonas, who treated me the way I'd always deserved to be treated, but never quite understood until now. Steven taught me what I didn't want in a relationship. Walking away from him taught me my own strength, that I could choose myself even when it was hard and scary. Life wasn't perfect, and I still had bad days where I felt lonely or uncertain about the future. But it was mine. My apartment, my choices, my path forward. And that was more than enough.